second session of the International Higher Education Commission. The Commission, as I'm sure you're all aware, was established last year in order to look at potentially what a new international education strategy might look like for the future, to ask key questions, not just about whether the 600,000 figure target, which after all has been met, is the right one, but also to look at in more granular detail about our approach to international students more broadly. Is the right support being provided in terms of student welfare, in terms of housing? How can we ensure that the international student pathway more broadly into the UK, it remains sustainable in the longer term? And how can we also look at other additional factors when it comes to international education, around transnational education, around ensuring that education exports and products remain at the very sort of top of the agenda, recognizing that this is a global market. Other countries such as the US, Canada and Australia are also looking and recognizing the value of international students and international education exports. At our last meeting, we had Robin Walker, the new chair of the Education Select Committee, address the group before we began a discussion on the future of international student visas, obviously a highly sort of topical one, in which we focused on potentially what reforms were needed, but how we could also protect for the future some of the changes and reforms that have happened in recent years, not least the 2-year post-study work visa. I'm actually delighted that we are being joined today by the sort of author of that reform, Lord Joe Johnson, my predecessor and successor as university's minister in days gone past. I'm also delighted today that we can announce the first tranche of the commissioners for the International Higher Education Commission. There will be another tranche that is announced at our next meeting, which is going to take place on the 21st of February at 2 p.m. and we'll be circulating details of that sort of in an email later. Ultimately, we want to encourage more students, international students in particular, to be part of the Commission, and we're looking forward and taking ahead a student voice discussion exclusively for February. But today I can announce that the commissioners who've agreed to join the International Higher Education Commission are so far Lord Joe Johnson, as I mentioned, and Joe will be speaking on the panel later on. Thank you, Joe. Lord David Willits, again, a former University Science, Research and Education Minister between 2010 and 2014. James Purnell, who you may recognise now as the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Arts London, previously a Labour Cabinet Minister in the Gordon Brown administration. Diana Beach, the Chief Executive Officer of London Higher, that's done a lot of work on a London international higher education strategy. Anne-Marie Graham, the Chief Executive Officer of UKCISA, and Anne-Marie Graham will be speaking on the panel also in a short while. Nick Beach, who is a board member of University Alliance, but also Vice-Chancellor of Middlesex University. Shira West, who we all know as the Vice-Chancellor of Nottingham University, but is also the international lead for the Russell Group, and we're delighted to have Russell Group participation as a result. And also Karen Bryan, the chair of Yorkshire Universities and the Vice-Chancellor of York St John University. So this is the sort of first tranche of commissioners that have announced. We've got a second tranche that will be coming shortly, but I'm delighted by the breadth of expertise and the knowledge that those commissioners who've agreed to take part will present to us. As part of the discussion today, however, we're going to be focusing on what I've termed the real economic value of international students. We often see official figures published, unfortunately, with quite a bit of a time lag by the government on the actual value of international education. In 2018, that value was 23.3 billion, a 9% increase. I often sort of trust the figures that come from the Higher Education Policy Institute more than actually the official figures sometimes. I'm delighted we've got the director for HEPI, Nick Hillman, who's going to speak to us in a moment. But and these may be slightly out of date, Nick. You might have to correct me. But the HEPI figures show a significantly different figure when it comes to looking at the actual true value economically to regions and cities of international students. So the overall figure being around £28.8 billion per single yearly intake of international students, which equates to around £390 per person in the UK. And what HEPI, I think, do so effectively for not just policymakers, but also for politicians, is break that down at a constituency level. So we see in particular, those constituencies that have large international student populations due to being located in the campus areas of regional universities, showing some really staggering economic benefits. So, for instance, Sheffield Central, £290 million international students contribute to that sort of particular constituency, or Nottingham South, I assume potentially from the work that Shearer and her team does for Nottingham University, £261 million. We have a fantastic group of panelists today who are going to discuss the real value, economic value of international students. I think it's important to reflect it's not just about pounds and pence. It's obviously about the opportunities that international students present more widely to regional economies when it comes to filling vacancies in employment, and also to understand potentially how they can future contribute economically beyond particular consumption. So in terms of the panelists today, we have Nick Hillman, Director of HEPI, as I've said, will open the discussion. Then we're going to turn to Anne-Marie Graham, Chief Executive of UKCISA, followed by Lord Joe Johnson. And Joe, obviously, I've mentioned his ministerial roles, but since then he's maintained fantastic engagement with the international education sector, having left Parliament, obviously still being in the House of Lords, with his work with Apply Board, and more recently sort of Future Learn, really engaging on the international opportunities of trying to bring international students to the UK. And then finally, we've got Polly Mackenzie. Polly, I've known obviously for many years, working at Demos and obviously working in the coalition government. She's now Social Purpose Officer for the University of Arts in London. And I know Polly feels passionately about the opportunities that international students can provide in terms of an economic value around soft power. Not to put words in her mouth, but I'm sure we want to get that discussion going around what is the true value economically of international students. So I'm now going to turn to Nick Hillman to open the discussion. Nick, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity and to be able to speak at your first meeting. It's a very impressive project, I think, including all the people you've already managed to convene to oversee it. And I think it's great, Chris, to see your enduring interest in this topic, and of course all those other policy areas you've been writing about, like the environment recently. And I'm very sorry to see you'll be leaving Parliament at the next election, because I think you've been a fantastic advocate for the sector and international students. So thank you for that. And as you said, we've been asked to address ourselves to the question of the real economic value of international students, and I will do that. But I think for the reasons Chris said at the start, one does need to contextualize that a little bit as well. In fact, we've got a report coming out later this week on Thursday about how the sector engages with policymakers. Joe Johnson helped us with that. Thank you, Joe. And one of our findings in that is if you only talk about the economic value of anything, when you talk to policymakers, they say, why are you being so utilitarian? And if you only talk about the non-economic benefits, they say, why are you not giving us the hard numbers? So I think you do have to mix the two things up a bit. And so I just want to start very briefly with a couple of less economic points. The first is, if you're not already signed up to the HEPI blog, I hope you will be so after this event. And the reason I plug it is we had a fascinating blog entry yesterday by someone called Naimat Safari, who's an Afghani student. He's a PhD student at the University of Sussex. He was on one of the very last planes out of Kabul when the Taliban took over Afghanistan again. And he's a Chevening scholar, and he's an amazing advocate for the power of education to transform people's lives. And he wrote for us yesterday about the limits to women's education, young girls' education in Afghanistan, and urged us all as a sector when we're thinking about international education, to think about people like those young girls in Afghanistan who are currently blocked out of schools, and also, of course, young women out of universities. And he said, I'll just read you a tiny bit that I hope the Commission can think about in the wider sense, how important it is to maintain a lifeline. We are, because we're not without an ability to act. Nelson Mandela wrote, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. It is my urgent, this is NIMAT's words, not mine. It is my urgent request to UK universities that we rise together to challenge the apartheid of our own age, that we give meaning to our values through action, that we let Afghan women and girls know they are neither forgotten nor alone, and that one day in the future we will applaud their own long walk to freedom, knowing we played our own small part in it. And the reason I start like that, because I think it is important. You know, most international students in the UK do go home again afterwards, and they take their skills and their knowledge back to their home countries all around the world. And I think that, you know, part of the economic value and the non-economic value of international students is back to their home countries. It's not just to the UK. The second point I wanted to make on the slightly less economic part of the debate is that every summer we do something called the HEPI Soft Power Index, and we look at how many world leaders were educated in the UK tertiary sector. It's quoted in the International Education Export Strategy that Chris mentioned. And every year that we've done it, and we've been doing it for about 6 years, we found about one quarter of the countries in the world have a very, very, very senior person, sort of people who were called VVVIPs when I worked in government. In other words, a monarch, a president or a prime minister educated in the UK tertiary sector. And the soft power benefits of that are incredible. They're mainly non-financial, but they are also financial because it helps with those trade deals. For example, if you've got a leader of a country that spent time in the UK, enjoyed their time here, absorbed our culture and our values, and put them to work in their own home nation as well. But let me move on specifically to your essay question, because as you said, Chris, we've done a lot of work over the years at HEPI on the stark economic numbers of international students coming to the UK. You know, they come here, spend lots of money, and very often either go home again or contribute their skills to the UK. And you quoted the most recent numbers, which are, as you say, about nearly £30 billion a year, effectively. And that's a gross figure. So, of course, the Home Office don't really accept that figure. They say, but international students come here and fill up our schools with their children and clog up our roads and all the other stuff that we know doesn't happen, but the Home Office sometimes think does happen. And so we calculate the number on a net basis as well as a gross basis. And even if you take into account all the costs of hosting so many international students, you still get a net positive annual number of 25 billion a year. And there's always a big time lag in the data. So when we recalculate these numbers, I expect that will have gone up significantly because, of course, the international students, despite COVID, are coming in greater numbers than ever before. And if you take it, and the second thing we do that's different to other people, and Chris, again, you teed me up very nicely for this, is we publish that data at a constituency level. So if you take a constituency, I know UAL, where one of our speakers is from, is a sprawling institution with presence all over London. But if you take one of their constituencies, Holborn and St Pancras, Keir Starmer's seat, the value of international students to that seat alone is £243 million a year, close to the Nottingham and Sheffield numbers you quoted, Chris. I should also say, of course, it is not just HEPI that does that piece of work. We've done it in conjunction with London Economics, Universities UK International Unit, and Kaplan International Pathway. So I can't take, I don't want you to think I'm taking all the credit for it. A couple of other bits of work we've done on the economic value of international students too. We did another one where we looked at the minority of international students in one cohort that stayed in the UK to work. And we looked at what they do in the 10 years after they've stopped their studies. Some of them drift home again in those 10 years. Some of them stay the whole 10 years, even become British citizens. And what we found is two very interesting things. They contributed, that one cohort, £3.2 billion to the Exchequer in national insurance and tax payments. And there was no evidence that we could find at all that they were taking jobs from British workers, because if they went into the private sector, they tended to be ending up on higher salaries than UK residents. In other words, they were delivering skills that their employers really had to pay for and were struggling to find without recruiting those international students, graduates. Or they were going into the public sector where they weren't earning more than the Brits, because fixed salaries in the public sector, but they're in areas like nursing, teaching, doctors, where there's a massive shortage of supply. So on both contribution to the Exchequer and they're bringing their skills, they were filling in gaps that we need in our economy. And that brings me, Chris, to the report that we published just the other day, the 5th of January. We always think it's very smart publishing a report the first week of the new year, because the journalists are at their desks, but other people haven't necessarily revved themselves up again. Turned out to be a very bad week to publish this year, because Rishi Sunak did his big 5-test speech. But nonetheless, it's a very interesting report that we did with the Institute of Directors and Kaplan International Pathways. And we went out and spoke to employers, and we said, you know, this graduate route visa might be the solution to your skill shortages. And Chris is kindly holding up a copy. You say you can't find the skills you need. Well, the graduate route visa is very light touch, no cost for employers. So there are some costs for the student. They can stay for 2 years. Joe Johnson said it should be 4 years, and I agree. It's 2 years, almost no questions asked. And it's been very successful where it's worked. But only 3% of the employers in our employer survey had yet made use of it. And another 27% of employers said that they'd never even heard of this thing. And when we followed up with a free text question, we found that, again, lots of employers, the quotes we've got were things like, I'm not sure of this new scheme. I'm not in a position to comment on it. Not heard of this. So I think there's a job to be done, as well as improving it, also just publicizing it. So I'll come to a close, Chris, because I know there's lots of other speakers with lots of other things to say, but I just want to flag one sort of conundrum and then a couple of other things. The conundrum is, of course, universities have been told, probably rightly, to reduce their over-reliance on China, you know, huge proportion of international students from China, and to diversify and get more students from India, more students from Africa. And they've done that. But those students from those other countries are different to the Chinese students. They're more likely to bring dependents. Their course choices can be a bit different. They sometimes want to be elsewhere in the UK. And I do feel a little bit as if sometimes universities are damned if they do and damned if they don't. They're damned if they recruit too many Chinese students, and they're damned if they recruit too many of the alternative international students to Chinese students. And so I think when we're thinking about dependence, we just need to, you know, remember that, particularly as these international students are making courses for British students economically viable. So I'm going to pause there, other than to say I wish you all the best in the commission. I hope we can be continue our engagement and happy with it, because I think it's so important. And if this hour and a quarter session doesn't sate people's appetite sufficiently, we happy also have a webinar tomorrow of a similar length tomorrow morning on internationalization of education. So you can register for that for free on our website if you've not had enough today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And if you want to, you know, do put the link in the chat box, or send it to me and I'll get it put in the chat box, the link before the end of the session. That's great. Thank you very much for setting out so comprehensively some of the challenges, not just around the data, but obviously that key point you're making around soft power and some of the intangible economic benefits also that are felt. I'm now going to turn to Anne-Marie Graham. Anne-Marie, thank you so much again for you were present in the discussion last time, but we're delighted to have you now as a panelist and also as a commissioner. So Anne-Marie, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and thanks, Nick, for that great introduction as well. I think it's really important to remind us of the important body of evidence that HEPI and its partners have built on the economic benefits of international students and their contribution to the local and national economies. Obviously, at the UK Council for International Student Affairs, or UKCISA, as we're more commonly known, we're well aware of those economic benefits, as are the international students themselves, I would say. But we're also keenly aware that the contributions of those international students go beyond direct benefits to the economy, and that those benefits go beyond their experience here in the UK. As Nick referenced, the soft power index and the significant proportion of world leaders educated in the UK. But it doesn't have to be a world leader to be able to demonstrate the power of that education. And the more international students we educate, the more we provide with the world-class education, not just on an academic level, but on a pastoral level as well, and even an immigration system level, then the greater the affinity that individual will develop with the UK, and the greater their understanding of the UK, its culture and its values, and the greater the understanding we have of our alumni network across the world. And I know the work of the British Council in this field is very important to bring that together. I think, I saw that very much myself as a former director of the Achieving Scholarship Scheme, that students went on to do a vast range of things in social responsibility and enterprise and development. And I think we really underestimate the impact of the UK education on the international graduate population. As Nick's reference to yesterday's HEPI blog shows, international students really do bring a range of life experiences and perspective to our education sector. And I think one important benefit that we could better quantify is that of internationalising the curriculum and the experience for all. So for home students, for academic staff, for even staff in professional services, there is an impact across all of the higher education sector from international students. And UKCISA run a We Are International Student Ambassador Programme, which has been very helpful and compelling in demonstrating the wealth of impact stories that international students contribute to their institution and to their local communities. I think one economic benefit we haven't touched on yet, of course, is that international students also make many courses economically viable for institutions, and it means that they open up a wealth of opportunities for domestic students as well as the international student population as well. And I think Nick has demonstrated very well how much international students pay their way, not just through tuition fees, but through the immigration health surcharge and through visa and immigration fees. So they make a huge financial contribution out of their own pockets as well. I think really what I wanted to pick on today is how at UKCISA we can emphasise the importance of supporting the international student experience to ensure that we maintain that economic benefit to the UK, and to do that by ensuring that our recruitment strategies in UK higher education are sustainable. We were very pleased after lobbying from the government's international education strategy when first launched in 2019 to see that the refresh in 2021 really stepped up the commitment to international student experience. I can't stress how important it is to see that emphasised in a government strategy. Because UKHE can't keep recruiting without thinking genuinely about the experience it provides to those students, whether that's an academic, social, cultural, or even financial experience. So obviously there's more that can be done to support the strategy's ambitions in this regard, not least to ensure that we measure progress in achieving it. And to help us do that as a sector and government, UKCISA last year launched the We Are International Charter, the We Are International Student Charter, as a framework for education providers and other sector stakeholders, including sector bodies and higher education commissions, to monitor progress against those ambitions. And one of the overarching principles that's set out in the charter, there are 5, is that the sector should value international students' perspectives and voices in policy and decision making. And I think the Commission is really helping this happen. I'm delighted to be a commissioner and help ensure that the international student voice is incorporated in the work of the Commission to shape and influence the future. So I think it's really putting the Charter into practice, and I'm very glad to see that. Another principle that I want to draw attention to today is that targeted support should be made available for international students in every area of the student experience through visas and immigration to settling here in the UK, the academic experience, the well-being, but also importantly, careers and employability. And that's why the HEPI research that Nick's just mentioned on the graduate route is so interesting, because what the UK could do a lot better at in terms of setting itself apart from other competitor markets is to demonstrate a strong commitment to international graduate outcomes, not just achieving them, but monitoring them and demonstrating them as well. We know that employability is extremely important to international students. I mean, why wouldn't it be when you're paying so much for your education? You obviously want to get a return on your investment. And the creation of the graduate route in 2021 offers real opportunities for employers and international students, but as the research shows, it needs more promotion. I think to go with that, the sector needs robust mechanisms for collecting data and evidence on what those individuals are doing in terms of their job roles, and that's whether they stay here in the UK or they return to their home country or even a third country, which, as Nick says, most graduates still do. So I think, you know, one thing we need to consider as a group is that the method for collecting data on international graduate outcomes changed at the end of 2021. And this has led to a significant decline in the response rate and therefore undermined the evidence base that the sector has. And I think that this risks sending a very negative message, implying that the outcomes of this section of the student population aren't as important perhaps as the home students. So it's imperative that further work is done with HISA and JISC to identify a mechanism to capture this data, not just leave it to individual institutions who can and do that. So I'll leave that as an introduction. I think we're going to have further conversation about that, but I just set out our stall and as I say, very grateful to see that the student voice is represented front and centre at the Commission by the inclusion of UKCISA. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Anne-Marie, and thank you for the points you made there, particularly obviously covering data and how we need to create that sort of strengthen the framework by creating the ability to have greater transparency to demonstrate progress. Lord Joe Johnson, I think is going to come in now as part of the panel. Joe, thank you very much again for joining us. Thanks for being a commissioner and look forward to your contribution.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and congratulations on setting up the International Higher Education Commission, and obviously also on your important review into net zero came out last week. And it's a great honour to be on the commission among the esteemed group that you've brought together, and also to be on this panel with such experts. So thanks for including me. There is, a sense in which this could be a sort of a motherhood and apple pie session where we all agree that international students are just wonderful and, what's the problem? I think the reality is, as we know, that there is a weakening consensus in British politics on the benefits of international students in our system. It's still there. There's still sort of a solid policy foundation thanks to the work of a number of people, many of whom are present on this call, to put in place the graduate route, to ensure that we haven't got a cap on numbers and so on. The basic policy architecture is still in place, but I think political support for it is weaker than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And I do think we need to acknowledge that and to understand why it's become weaker and what the sector needs to do to reinforce support for international study and its contribution to the UK. To my mind, it's ironic that some of the sort of loudest critics of international students and what they bring to the UK are actually on the right of the Conservative Party, because as Nick has pointed out many, many times, the success of the UK in international student mobility was a great Thatcherite reform when Mrs. Thatcher, in one of her most controversial early decisions, removed the public subsidy from international students, deregulated them in terms of the numbers of international students that could come to the UK, and allowed universities to operate in a free market for international student recruitment. So, it is a little bit ironic now that we have sort of the Thatcherite voices in the party saying, well, hold on a second, has this all gone too far? Do we need to rein it in again? Not recognizing that deregulation has actually been an incredible boon in many, many ways. Doubly ironic because international students are hugely supportive of the recent Conservative government's two big policy ideas: one, Global Britain, and two, levelling up. International students contribute meaningfully to both of those. Global Britain is sort of, as Nick was saying in his remarks, you know, a real contribution to how people around the world see the UK. Many of them see the UK through the lens of having studied here. Many of them occupying leadership positions in their home countries now. It's a huge benefit to us in our soft power. They take home with them ties that over the years go on to become ties of trade and investment and lots of other things. So huge benefit to Global Britain and a huge benefit to levelling up as Nick's and others work on the regional and constituency contributions of international students has made abundantly clear. So to have a policy of reining in international student recruitment or sort of crashing the numbers back down would be, you know, a big setback to my mind to the government's sort of two big ideas: Global Britain and levelling up. In terms of, you know, what the sector can do to shore up the consensus in support of international students and their position in our system, we've got to help avoid false narratives setting in into the debate. And there are many of these false narratives out there. And just to cite a couple of them, there's obviously the narrative around crowding out, the sense that, or the idea that international students are crowding out domestic students and depriving home students of places that they might otherwise have secured. It's a complicated argument to make, but we do need to get out there and make it better, that international students create capacity in the system and make viable courses that would not otherwise be offered. That argument is solid, it is robust, and we need to confidently assert it. Otherwise, we're going to find the policy environment, the sort of the political environment, become increasingly difficult for all the reasons people on this call well understand, due to the funding pressures on the domestic side and the increasing difficulty universities have in making the sums stack up with domestic recruitment. Another false narrative that we need to try and head off is all the historic baggage around immigration and international students overstaying. Now, this has proved, you know, surprisingly hard to kill off as a critique, you know, because it was so sort of categorically asserted as fact by the Theresa May administration that international students were overstaying in their tens or even hundreds of thousands. Of course, you know, that allegation was unfounded, and when the data was finally established, it was revealed that international students were actually the most compliant of all visa categories across our entire immigration system. Nonetheless, it sort of sticks around in the whole argument about international students that they're somehow this sort of rogue category. Of course, they're not. And as Nick was saying, international students have a great benefit to bring to our system at a time of acute labour shortages. They're net fiscal contributors, and basically they're everything you could possibly want in a very tight labour market. So those are just a few opening thoughts, Chris, and thanks so much for having me on your commission.
Thank you, Joe, and I love the way you've sort of set out the sort of slaying of the false narratives as potentially sort of a priority to then sort of move forwards into actually understanding that if we don't achieve that start with, we won't necessarily be able to reach the audiences that we may need to make the policy recommendations. So thank you very much, and for your honesty as well, I think, in making some of those points. I'm now going to turn to Polly Mackenzie. Polly, as I said, has recently been appointed Chief Social Purpose Officer at the University of Arts London. I think, am I right in saying, Polly, the University of Arts London, I think, has the largest number of international sort of students, I think, registered, certainly in London, if not maybe the UK. I can't remember the exact figures, but I know that certainly international students make up a huge proportion of the university and the contribution that they play in campus life as well as the economic life of London. Well, I can't hear you, unfortunately. I don't know if you're muted, though. I think it's maybe a...
Is that any better?
There we go. Yeah, absolutely.
My computer doesn't like Zoom. We like Teams. It's some sort of Microsoft thing. Anyway, so yes, University of the Arts London, about 43% of our undergraduates are international students. It's a higher proportion for our postgraduate taught and postgraduate research routes. If you don't know us, we are biggest art and design university in the world. We have about 22,000 students in total, and we are very much a specialist institution. We teach art, design, fashion, furniture, journalism, print, game, film, those kinds of subjects, incredibly vocational pathways into jobs throughout the creative industries for our graduates. And that includes us supporting, therefore, not just the creative industries in the United Kingdom, but also supporting, as Joe says, Global Britain's influence in the global creative industries. It's already been said, but it's worth reinforcing from a provider perspective that we simply cannot afford to provide as many home places as we do without the subsidy from international students. We spend a lot on our students. The subjects we are teaching are very space hungry, they're equipment hungry, and they are stuff hungry. And so therefore we spend almost as much per student as Oxford and Cambridge. And these courses are very heavily oversubscribed, including from home students. We have been able to expand because of the number of international students that we have. They also, of course, subsidize our research outputs. So we're the biggest contributor of art and design research in the REF. We cannot afford to do the research without the subsidies that come from both some of the knowledge exchange work we do with business, but also across subsidy it comes from our international students. And I think it's part of this narrative, as Joe says, that international students are cannibalizing places from home students really does need to be squashed, because it's the exact opposite, with the exception of some universities who are constrained in terms of numbers. And I think the pressure and enthusiasm for our universities to grow where they can should be where the government pressure is when it comes to finding places for our home students. We know that lots of university towns and cities are struggling with the ability to grow because of the constraints of our planning system, of housing, of office space, laboratory space. And whilst that's partly true in London, I think it's a massive barrier to growth elsewhere. And so in terms of being able to meet this enormous need from our phenomenal kind of globally successful universities, we do need to think about making the case for the wider reforms that can help universities be contributing to the growth of their places, the thriving economies of their places. And that does butt you up against other interests who are keen to limit development. And I think we cannot turn a blind eye to that, because there's no question that when it comes to education and housing for international students, it's a disaster for everybody if the provision isn't there. It's a disaster for the international students if they can't find a decent place to live that's close to campus. It is a disaster if they have to commute hugely, emitting carbon and contributing even more than they are by traveling to the UK in the first place. And it's also a disaster for established communities. So I think making sure that housing provision is there is incredibly important going forward. But I think it's also important to think about what our home students get from being on an international campus that is full of people from all over the world, and certainly in the service of the creative industries, the creative subjects that we teach. But I'm just sort of sure it's true no matter what you are studying, that sense of being surrounded by people with different perspectives, different ideas, and different experiences sets people up for a different way of engaging with the world that I believe creates enormous value for home students. They're exposed to different languages, they're exposed to different cultures and ideas, and so certainly our process of assessment includes these kind of group critique sessions where students will be looking at and experiencing and challenging each other's work, bringing that kind of cultural diversity to their educational experience, which just wouldn't be possible in the much more homogenous environment that you would get if it was only home students. And then finally, Nick mentioned that I would talk about soft power, and he's right, because it's sort of a great sadness to me that I think soft power has gone out of fashion. I used to run Demos, as has been mentioned, and we were involved in the sort of the Cool Britannia movement in the early Blair years. And that sense of what it meant to be proud to be British and try and lead the world has somehow got lost, I think, because on the right, it's too soft, and on the left, it's too much power. The idea of being sort of proud to be British and want to be cultural leaders instead of, worrying that is somehow jingoistic or kind of British exceptionalism has been lost. And so I think it is really important for us to realize this, the HEPI does the power index of the number of global leaders who have trained in our universities. UAL has trained the CEOs of fashion companies in China that are then embedding sustainable practices they learn in the UK in what they're doing. Filmmakers in Africa and in India who have trained at UAL and bringing the practice and the cultural lens and building kind of global creative networks that are part of the changes that we need to see. And also, again, there's a lot of concern at the moment in public policy around China and China's influence, a worry about Chinese soft power, embedding it in itself in the UK. But, I don't want to dismiss those concerns out of hand. I think they're important, but it's also worth observing that certainly the students whose work I've seen in our graduate showcases, so many of those Chinese or other East Asian students are protesting as loudly against the system as our home students, as European students, and they are producing protest art that is part of challenging, talking about, for example, the abuse of the one-child system, talking about women's rights in Central Asia. And our students are empowered to develop those ideas, to express themselves as individuals, to, come out as gay or lesbian or bisexual in ways that they wouldn't necessarily be allowed to do in home countries. And they can take that freedom back potentially, and is part of what's, like I say, gone out of fashion, the idea of spreading liberal values, whether they're British or not, liberal values, liberal democratic values around the world. And it's worth reminding ourselves that Ai Weiwei, famous Chinese protest artist, was one of the first generation of Chinese students who were allowed to study outside of that country. So I don't think we should sort of only think of the idea of students coming to us as being a way of other countries encroaching on Britain. I think it's part of that broader, still important mission of spreading and empowering liberal democratic values through the amazing excellence that you find in our British universities.
Holly, thank you so much. And that sort of ends the panelists' contributions. And we'll go to some points that can be now made either by commissioners or members of the audience who want to reflect back on some of the points that panelists have made. I might just take the sort of chair's prerogative to ask a question. It might be a false narrative in Joe's words, but I just wondered, we in terms of the overall umbrella term of international students, obviously there's been a sort of effort to think about certain South Asian, ASEAN nations, South India as potential I wouldn't use the word target, but sort of, it sounds rather crude, but sort of countries where potentially there will be a stronger interest in investing in international student pathways for the future. I know Joe's done some great work on this at the Harvard Kennedy School on looking at sort of dependence on China and potentially the opportunities that India presents. And also I know that Nick's work in the past has sort of looked at, obviously we've seen a decimation of the sort of the EU route after the end of sort of home fee status. But obviously EU students were, I think, roughly about £70,000 per student compared to a non-EU student of about £100,000. Whether it's too crude to think about certain countries or areas potentially being economically more attractive for the UK, or potentially whether the UK has done the right thing in sort of focusing on moving across into South Asia, or whether there's other areas that potentially in comparison to the States or Australia, they've cornered a sort of area of economic activity that we won't be able to access anymore. I wonder whether, Joe, I know you've been doing work at Applyboard as well on this, whether there's any thoughts you had about the disaggregation of the international student by particular region globally.
There are great experts on this in the seminar. I can see David Pillsbury, for example, who's a serious expert on these questions, and Anne-Marie and others. I mean, I would just say that the excessive reliance on recruitment from a couple of big countries is a problem. It's just imprudent to put all your eggs in a couple of baskets. Obviously the Russell Group has gone for a yield maximizing strategy of getting the most revenue per student placed that they possibly can, and that has led them to go heavy on China, whose students on average are paying about £21,000 a year. Outside the Russell Group, students have recruited very heavily from India, where students are paying half that amount per year on average. But the same risks in different ways arise from overdependence on a single market for particular institutions. So these are real issues. The sector needs to ensure that their student populations, their international student populations, are properly diversified, not just for financial risk management, but also for the learner experience. Students benefit from a diverse environment, and that's not always being achieved with current patterns of international student recruitment. And I think it would be good if the OFS took a bit more of a view on patterns of international student recruitment, both from a financial resilience point of view, but also from a learner experience point of view. And I strongly echo the points that Anne-Marie was making in her opening remarks about capturing better information about outcomes. We shouldn't think that this is something that's just of interest to the students themselves. This is of great interest to the governments of sending countries whose students are investing heavily in international higher education in the UK. And they don't want to see them and their families loaded up with debt and then unable to get good jobs that enable them to pay off the debts and make a decent living. This is a politically important issue, and it will be an increasingly important one in India, for example.
Thanks, Joe. We have a hand up from Ruth Arnold. Ruth, I don't know if there's any particular member of the panel you wanted to bring your point across to, but please.
Thank you very much, Chris. I wanted to respond to what Joe had said about the sense of a weakening consensus around international students. I think it's absolutely right. And I think that there's a mild reassertion of some of the narratives that we heard before under the Theresa May administration, which we've got to be careful of. I think there's two dichotomies that we need to think about challenging. One is the global versus the local. you know, the citizens of somewhere or nowhere split, and that somehow if you're supporting international students, that you are on the, you know, metropolitan elite, and university is seen as a kind of mini London in the provinces. When I got involved in working on the net benefit of international students and the We're International campaign, I was right in the middle of the Red Wall in Sheffield. And we did the first study into that. And we found, for example, then, and I'm sure it's double that now, that 10% inward investment into the city region was international students. And that's not counting all the jobs that were created. If something that created 10% inward investment in a region was due to be coming in the form of a car factory, people would be falling over themselves to look at tax breaks, to look at joined up planning. I did see this with Boeing and other people coming in. There isn't the same thing with international students, partly because it's invisible. And I think we're going to have to change that, because otherwise the pressures on accommodation will mean we start getting domestic rejection that's going to start landing in MPs' inboxes, and people are going to say, I'm sorry, I'm not having my child living in a different place because there's all these international students. So I think there's going to have to be a new kind of joined up, much more proactive policy engagement to enable that inward investment that to a certain extent beforehand we've just received and maybe not even already acknowledged. I don't know if you can hear me still. Can you hear me? Okay. The other point is the Adam Habib point from SOAS about whether international students are seen as, you know, as somehow fueling inequity, a global inequity, by taking students from the global south to the global north. And I think we are going to have to get our heads around that. And I, as somebody who has both really welcomed high-paying international students and works in that area myself, I've also was involved in working with Afghan scholars. So I think we need to think about other ways of reaching out, connecting, offering scholarships, potentially some of the wonderful ideas coming out of Future Learn around offering online education. But we're going to have to get our heads around some of these perceived divides. Otherwise, we could see ourselves falling down one side or another of those narratives. And I just, well, I offer my own support in any way that's helpful in trying to avoid those. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. We've got a number of hands up now. So if anyone does want to contribute, now is the time. Raise your hand and I'll be able to take you in the sequence of which hands went up. So we've now got Nick Beach, Vice Chancellor at Middlesex University, and one of the commissioners announced today. Nick.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody for a really fantastic set of presentations on the panel. I just wanted to raise a point of emphasis really on something very different to what's been said. And that's particularly thinking about the contributions that occur through business startup, spin out, and indeed scale up. And particularly given international students and the various roles that they can play in business creation of one sort or another. I think this is one of the things that we probably want to look at a bit more closely, but also think about the narrative associated with that, and things like the number of jobs created, those sorts of things that actually can really appeal in quite a straightforward way to people who have become embedded in other narratives. And to pick up on actually part of what Ruth was saying, but Anne-Marie and others were saying, this also then particularly relates to research students, to postgraduate taught students as well, and make sure that we have that holistic view. So I suppose it's a bit of a comment, but a question for the panel in terms of, should we be finding an appropriate way of emphasizing business startup, spin out and scale up as part of what we look as a contribution?
I don't know if any of the panel want to come back on that. We'll take another couple of points and maybe reflect on those in a group, maybe. So pause the business startup point that Nick's made, and maybe David Law to come in.
Thank you very much, and pleasure to be in this meeting. I think it's a fantastic initiative that's taking place. My point to the panel is about the possibility that we will find attacks on the permissions that we currently have in UK university to recruit international students. In particular, I think it's quite likely there's going to be a serious look at the issue of dependence coming with students. And we know, of course, that this applies to postgraduate taught students. So I wonder if anybody can furnish me with a couple of really good arguments for saying that it continues to be important that students should come to the UK with their dependents.
And I think, should we take also a question from Louise, and then maybe I'll reflect back on some of the panel's discussions before coming to Dr. Iqbal. Louise?
Yeah, so on David's point, just briefly, I think it will be very difficult to dissuade what is a relatively hell-bent Home Secretary on the dependent side. The other thing I would say is that dependence, setting up family life in the UK means people are more likely to stay, which is absolutely great if they're skilled and get great skilled work and everything else. But when you bring your family somewhere, uprooting a family, I know I've done it millions of times, like a lot of times living overseas, it is actually very difficult. So bringing family members makes the UK more sticky, not less sticky. But we must remember that in the present data, 90% of international students return home. Now, this is likely to change because of the different makeup of our population, more students from South Asia and Africa. But in the Australian context, that have a lot of students from those countries, just 17% of international students stay in Australia, 17%. So 80-odd% are returning home. So we really need, and waiting for JISC and HISA to get their acting gear on international graduate outcomes, it's just not going to happen. It took 2 years to review graduate outcomes. It'll be another, it might be even a decade before we get our act together for non-EU graduate outcomes. So let's get this data and let's support students go home, because I agree, there's lots I don't agree with Professor Habib about. But one of the things I do agree with him is us taking all of Nigeria's nurses and midwives and doctors and health professionals is not doing Nigeria any help at all. And we should really be encouraging our international students to go home and fuel economic growth in their own countries and be massively successful there, because that's leveling up globally. If we want to level up, and we're serious about leveling up, let's level up the world. Let's give, Afghan girls a chance of education. Let's do these things. Let's focus the skills where they're needed most. And that's not in the West. So yeah, that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Does the panel want to come back and reflect on some of the points that have been made in those contributions? We've got the issue around tracking the economic value of potential startups and business development, and then that question around, which I think is going to be central, around dependence. And I don't know, Nick, whether you've been looking at sort of the economic value of dependence at the same time as the students themselves, whether that can be disaggregated. Sort of what that says ultimately to the loss the UK may face, but also at the same time, Joe's talked about narratives and understanding dependence, and potentially whether that's an issue for particular countries that are seeking to establish new international student pathways. But Anne-Marie Graham, sorry, Nick.
Oh, sorry. I was going to chip a couple of points in, but whenever you want me to, Chris.
No, yeah, Nick, come in, and then Anne-Marie, that'd be great.
Yeah. So yeah, on dependence, I mean, the work that you and I quoted about the financial contribution of international students last came out in autumn 2021. Don't want to break too many confidences because we work with others on these projects, but we are hoping to redo that work and to put a greater focus on dependence. In my response to David Law's comment would be partly, we haven't been as good as we could be as a sector of reminding people that you don't just bring your dependents and then they rely on the British state. You have to prove very, very substantial financial resources to pay for those dependents while they're in the UK. And I don't think we've really won that debate. I think there's this perception they come here and are sort of taking things from the rest of us. They're not. They have to have very substantial resources to come. And of course, undergraduates can't bring dependents anyway. And then just while I've got the microphone, Chris, the other point I'd like to make, I think you made a very important point in your first question about other parts of the world. We mustn't give up on the EU, because although the EU numbers have fallen off a cliff, you know, we are still in Europe. We are still, apart from Ireland, the only country in the world where every class is taught in English. We you know, have more universities in the global league tables than the rest of European Union, than the European Union put together. So there are still very, very, very attractive reasons why people from other EU countries should want to come and study here in similar numbers to when they got the subsidy. And Joe made the powerful point that, you know, getting rid of a subsidy is sometimes the kick you need to really chase that market. So I would love to see a greater focus on EU students and us going out there and finding them the way we go out and find students from other countries.
Thank you very much. Anne-Marie, did you want to come in, and also any members of the panel want to raise any points before I go back to some of the questions?
Yeah, and I can be brief because Nick's already made a couple of the points that I would have made, and you know, very, very well. But I think we also need to remember that actually UKVI's own data demonstrates that the compliance of the routes with dependents, it is only postgraduate students that, you know, undergraduates can't bring dependents, and international students form a significant proportion of the sector's postgraduate taught and research students. So to tell someone that they're to come for 1 year plus, I mean, for PhD many years, and not to be able to bring their families, essentially, you know, draws a line under, you know, it really makes that choice a very difficult one for that individual. So the UKVI's own data will demonstrate that the number of dependents coming in with students is in line with the age profile and the overall profile of the international students. So I think we have some strong evidence from the government's own data sets to push back on the more political concerns around that Joe has highlighted in his contributions. It is not necessarily coming from the Home Office, it may be coming from Number 10 or from others. And I think we need to be very aware of that actually the government has its own very credible data sets that we can use to demonstrate the case that we want to make for international students and their dependents. As I say, that, you know, as Nick pointed out, they have to provide strong financial evidence that they can come here to the UK to live. They pay the immigration health surcharge, so they're contributing in that way. But you know, as Ruth has touched on, there are issues around accommodation, which I think is something is a wider housing issue across the whole of the UK, not just affecting students. And that's something that government policy may need to think about. But that in terms of David's question about what can I use to go back on this, these are compliant, credible individuals coming to the UK. It's natural given the population demographics, and I think, you know, the government's own data bears that out.
Thank you very much. We've got Polly from the panel would like to come back on some of the points, and then I'm going to go to Dr. Iqbal. So Polly. Oh, I think your computer's not liking Zoom again. No luck. No, not yet. No.
Oh well.
There we go. Here we are. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Third time lucky.
Great. So what was I going to say? We can't have our cake and eat it. We're not Boris Johnson. There is that. Sometimes we go, oh, it's exports. Oh, they're going home, and we kind of over promise, I think, in terms of just the infrastructural impact of a volume of people. And I'm massively supportive of particularly, you know, graduate students being able to bring their spouse or their kids for these, you know, high level degrees. But the reality is there is pressure on infrastructure. And as a country, we do need to decide whether we want to build the infrastructure for a growing population, or whether we want to do what we're doing at the moment, which is have a growing population without building the stuff, the houses, the schools, the railways, or whether actually we do want to submit to just a different view, which plenty of people here won't agree with, but which is actually about trying to reduce the number of people here or manage that population growth with a much more aggressive anti-immigration stance. And, you know, I know very firmly where I stand on that, but we just shouldn't, I guess, pretend away the realities of it. Yes, technically in the accounts, but it's also not exports. It's also people coming here, occupying rooms and buildings and place on the train carriages. So let's try instead to make the case for what it means to be a thriving, growing country that's excited about that opportunity instead of pretending it away.
Thank you, Polly. Dr. Iqbal, you took your hand down. You still like to come in? Not sure whether you might need to take your microphone off if you wanted to mute. I'll come back to George Abraham has his hand up, and I'll come back to you, Dr. Iqbal, if you'd like to come in. George.
Thank you very much. Very, very informative. 2 points really that I want to bring up. Lord Johnson was at the launch of the India UK Achievers Award at the House of Commons on the 12th of October. And after China, Indian students are the largest cohort. And I don't know whether any of you are aware that on the 25th of January, it's 75 Indian candidates who've either studied here at undergraduate, postgraduate, or PhD, and have gone on to do something significant in their lives, impactful, not only for the UK, globally, are going to be recognized. When I approach a number of universities in my network to find out whether they knew of their Indian students, alumni, I was shocked. They did not keep a tally of their students, where they are, what they're doing, and the implication and the message that universities are giving, and we as universities in that space cannot absolve ourselves out of it, is we are not taking care. We seem to think that we want the money, we'll teach them, and they go away. That's the end of it. No. You've got to know who these people are. They're the ones who are going to bring the next batch of startups, the next batch of leaders. And more before that, what I would like to say is, when I approach many universities for transnational education, the response I get is shocking as well. They assume I want to be an agent. They do not ask what it is that I'm looking for. And, you know, if only universities did a bit of joint up linking with the industries in their neighborhood, they will multiply global Britain's exports, because these students are the ones, as Louise mentioned, are going to grow the businesses of the SMEs, not the big ones. The SMEs in the value chain are going to grow in the emerging markets of the world, not in the UK. And if we miss that trick today and in the future, we're going to miss a huge amount of opportunity. And the next area, apart from, as all of you have alluded to, is if we don't spread our risk, we've got to look at other emerging markets beyond India and China. We've got to be smart about our T&E collaborations. We've got to look at the emerging markets of Africa. There's a whole host of things happening there. We've got relationships, we've got soft power relationships, but what we are doing is we are turning those relationships into dead ducks. And I'm talking to lots of universities, lots of governments, lots of industries. And what is happening is we tend to think that we've got a model, you take it or leave it. You're not being flexible to think and being agile in looking at where the world is going. COVID has taught us something, and I'll stop there, that we've got to deliver things in a different way. And therefore, what we've got to look at, what are the jewels in our crown, in our assets, in our courses, and where are they going to fit into the future? And how can we collaborate with the smart leaders and startups and students through scholarships or whatever, and grow the business? That's my piece. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. And yeah, I think an important call to action. Dr. Iqbal, would you like to come in at all? I know you had your hand up, or you're okay. You're okay. Great. In terms of, we're coming to a close shortly, sadly. I mean, I'm grateful for everyone being able to make the time today. I'm sure we can just continue this discussion far longer. Whether any members of the panel would like to make any sort of closing reflection remarks before we wrap up, reflecting on some of the points that have been made in our discussion today. I might ask if I could turn to Nick, because he's always great value for sort of kicking off, and then go to Anne-Marie Graham, and then Joe Johnson. I know Polly Mackenzie's had to leave early. So over to Nick.
Well, thanks, Chris. I don't want to say much, because actually I'm finding I'm learning more. I'm absorbing more than I'm giving out during this session, because you've brought such a talented group of people together. I think Nick Beach's point about startups was very powerful. I thought the point we just heard about keeping in touch with your alumni was very powerful. I thought the work that Ruth Arnold's done, who was more positive than anybody I know about the capacity of international students to transform their own lives and other people's lives, and was actually partly behind that blog I talked about at the beginning from NIMAT, I think is so powerful. So I think at the very least what this hour's done for me is show the power that you've brought together among your commission. But I do think Joe was right as well, Joe Johnson at the beginning. We mustn't just get together in rooms where we all agree with each other. You must engage with David Goodhart or the maybe not Migration Watch, but people of that bent, to try to understand where their fears, unfounded fears, come from, because all the evidence, it always seems to me, is on our side in this debate. But thanks again for letting me be part of it.
Anne-Marie?
Yeah, I mean, also to echo my thanks. I think, not just thanks for including me and Nikita on the commission, but I think thank you for a really useful session today that really sort of highlighted some of the more pressing challenges that the sector has to face, and some of the issues that we have to think about when we're thinking about the international student experience and ensuring the sustainability of that international student pipeline to the UK. I think there's been lots of pointers in terms of where we need to demonstrate what we know more clear, with more emphasis and more confidence, but also where there are gaps as well in terms of what we need to pull that evidence together. So I think that's been a very useful starting point for us all. And yeah, I think I've shared a lot, but I've also learned a lot as well. And I think it's been a really, really useful first session. Thank you.
And Joe, any final comments you'd like to make before I just close this?
Thanks, Chris. Actually, I wanted to ask you if you might set out just a little bit about the timeline of the Commission's work and when it's what you want to achieve from it, what success looks like for you from this work, and when it's going to report and that sort of thing. Yeah, certainly. So in terms of the Commission, I think it's slightly grown in terms of its ambition from when I initially set up, in that we just simply wanted to produce a single document maybe by sort of April. We're looking at doing a monthly session, so that the next sessions will be on the 21st of February, again at Tuesday 2 p.m. We're actually going to make that an all-student panel. We're working at the moment about appointing our student commissioners, and we're looking to get a broad range and diverse reflection from a various number of countries that have come to the UK, and that's what we'll be working on for our next session. I'm keen that actually when it comes to the Commission, rather than just produce a single document,
I've done that with the net zero review, and there's a time and a place for a big single document that actually we produce a sequence of documents that reflect on particular policy levers that we would like to see as the Commission enable the government to be able to meet its commitments on international students, but also to really, as you say, Joe, take on those false narratives. I think there's quite a commonality of calls with net zero, if I'm honest. Half the time, the battle is around articulating the value and the opportunity and the potential that the future engenders when it comes to a number of these policy recommendations. But in particular, I think what we will look to do is produce a paper on the visa opportunities and where that might go for the future, potentially then a paper on the student experience. And I think with that, we'll be sort of wrapping in, each of these areas could potentially have a paper by itself, but looking at housing, accommodation, and the understanding of what is needed to create the best possible international student experience on campus, and then a wider piece on the economic value. Whether this works or not, I'm quite keen to say we've used this session today to reflect on the potential loss that we might suffer if we lose what we have spent so long trying to build up. So in the net zero report, I've tried to shift the narrative. So net zero isn't just an environmental measure. It is an economic agency for the future, which we can deliver economic growth. We all know that when it comes to international students, this isn't just about education. It is about training up a whole generation of young people who are going to go back to their countries, has been so well articulated today. And I'd be really keen to take on that as a separate sort of piece of work. And all these papers, in a way, will come together as chapters then of a international education strategy 2.0. And if this administration wants to take it forwards, that would be fantastic. But recognizing the politics of the situation, we will be in a general election period soon enough. I won't be standing in that general election, but I'm keen to also ensure that we can feed into the manifesto commitments as part of that general election as well. So I think there are a number of audiences that I want the Commission to address, to articulate, to point to the HE sector, as you say, and say we've got to be honest with ourselves about what we want and what we potentially can reform for the future. But at the same time, those political audiences that will be making future policy making decisions, that we have the opportunity to feed into that at that early stage.
Thank you.
Well, I think with that, that brings, I think, a close to this session. As I said, next session, 21st February, you'll get details, but we're going to make it an all-student voice session. We're going to hear from the students themselves, and we'll be announcing our student commissioners in turn. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining. As everyone said, I've learned a lot, and it's been fantastic to engage with everyone once again. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.